In the vast, unforgiving plains of South Dakota, where the landscape stretches endlessly toward the horizon, January 2021 brought a cold so severe that it made even the most hardened locals tremble. As temperatures plummeted to negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit, winds howling at 60 miles per hour transformed the prairie into a deadly frozen wasteland. For the ranchers of South Dakota's central region, this wasn't just another winter storm. It was a battle for survival. The thermometer broke after it hit -45, recalls John Hendrickson, a third-generation cattle rancher from Hyde County. But we knew it was getting colder because the diesel in our trucks turned to gel and the moisture in our breath froze before it hit the ground. As darkness fell on January 15th, the power grid failed across 3 counties. The blackout left thousands without heat, light, or communication. Cell towers stopped functioning, roads became impassable, and with each passing hour the temperature dropped further. For the scattered ranching families of the region, isolation became a death sentence as traditional shelters proved inadequate against nature's fury. But in this moment of desperation, an unlikely solution emerged from the landscape itself. The massive grain silos that dot the South Dakota countryside, cylindrical steel giants originally built to store corn, wheat, and soybeans. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable stories of human ingenuity and survival in America's heartland. Hey folks, if you're enjoying this incredible story of survival and ingenuity, take a second to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Are you experiencing extreme weather where you live right now? I'd love to hear your stories as we continue this remarkable journey together. The silos stood like sentinels across the frozen landscape, empty after the fall harvest, their thick metal walls and circular design initially built to protect grain from moisture and pests. But on that brutal January night, Tom Blackwood, a 58-year-old rancher with a reputation for unconventional problem-solving, saw something different in the 40-foot structure on his property. Everyone was trying to huddle in their basements or garages, Blackwood later told the Rapid City Journal. But I kept thinking about how warm it gets inside those silos in summer, almost like a thermos, and I figured, if they can keep heat in, maybe they could keep cold out. What followed was a race against the clock and the deadly cold. Using farm equipment and sheer determination, Blackwood and his son Michael cut an improvised doorway into the base of their empty silo. They hauled in a wood stove from their workshop, along with every blanket, sleeping bag, and piece of furniture they could manage. The circular structure created a natural barrier against the wind, while the metal walls, once insulated from the inside with tarps and hay bales, began to contain the heat from the stove. The temperature inside hit 55 degrees within 2 hours, Michael Blackwood remembered. Meanwhile, outside, it was so cold that trees were splitting from the frost, and wildlife was freezing where they stood. As word spread through emergency radio communications, other desperate families began to see their own grain silos in a different light. By midnight, at least 7 silos across Hyde, Hand, and Buffalo counties had been transformed into makeshift shelters. The improvised refugees saved an estimated 48 people and countless animals during the 3-day deep freeze that meteorologists would later call a once-in-a-century polar vortex event. For the Erickson family, 5 miles east of Highmore, the silo shelter literally meant the difference between life and death. Emma Erickson, 9 months pregnant at the time, went into labor as temperatures reached their lowest point. With medical help impossible to reach, she gave birth to her daughter inside a grain silo, assisted by her husband and a neighbor with veterinary experience. "We named her Sila," Emma explained, which means breath in Latin, because in that silo, while everything outside was frozen and still, we found breath and life. As darkness gave way to a gray winter dawn, families huddled in these unlikely sanctuaries could see the devastation outside. Frozen cattle, collapsed, outbuildings, and a landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. But inside the silos, South Dakota's ranching community had found a way to survive, using nothing but the resources at hand and generations of prairie ingenuity. The grain silo's unexpected role as a lifesaver wasn't merely a happy accident. It was a testament to both the inherent genius of its design and the adaptability of rural communities in crisis. These towering cylindrical structures, ranging from 30 to 60 feet tall and up to 30 feet in diameter, are ubiquitous features of the Midwestern landscape. with South Dakota alone housing over 15,000 of them across its agricultural belt. What most people don't understand about silos is that they're essentially giant thermos bottles, explains Dr. Harold Lancaster, an agricultural engineering professor at South Dakota State University. Their primary function is to maintain a consistent environment for grain storage, keeping out moisture, pests and temperature fluctuations. This design principle made them accidentally perfect for human shelter during extreme weather events. The curved walls naturally deflect wind instead of creating resistance, preventing the structure from being as vulnerable to gale force winds as rectangular buildings. The thick steel or concrete construction provides substantial insulation, while the circular shape minimizes heat loss by reducing corners where cold air can penetrate. For the ranchers of Hyde County, these architectural advantages became clear through desperate necessity rather than theoretical knowledge. When Tom Blackwood first suggested using his silo as shelter, even he wasn't fully aware of the scientific principles that would make his plan successful. I just knew that in harvest season, when those silos are full, you can climb up top and feel the warmth rising even on cool days, Blackwood explained. Something about the way they're built just holds heat. What the ranchers discovered through trial and error was that grain silos create what engineers call a thermal mass, a dense material that absorbs and stores heat energy. During the deadly cold snap, once the improvised wood stoves began operating inside the silos, the metal walls gradually absorbed heat and radiated it back into the space, creating a remarkably stable environment. More impressively, the ranchers intuitively implemented key adaptations that maximized the silos' protective qualities. The Johansson family, sheltering 6 miles northwest of Highmore, used hay bales stacked around the interior circumference to create an insulating layer between the metal walls and the living space. This improvised insulation mirrored modern construction techniques using air gaps to improve thermal efficiency. Other families discovered that the tall vertical space of the silos created natural convection currents that distributed heat throughout the structure. By positioning heat sources near the floor, they unknowingly created a convection current that carried warm air upward and then back down along the walls, effectively heating the entire space without mechanical assistance. What these ranchers did, without any formal training, was create a remarkably efficient passive heating system, noted Lancaster. In some ways, it's more sophisticated than many modern homes. The silo shelters also demonstrated another critical survival advantage: structural integrity during extreme conditions. While conventional farm buildings suffered catastrophic failures under the weight of snow and ice combined with wind stress, not a single silo used as emergency shelter reported structural damage. The cylindrical design distributed stress evenly across the structure, preventing the buckling and collapse that affected rectangular buildings. For the Miller family, whose wooden barn collapsed just 30 minutes after they relocated to their silo, this structural integrity was the difference between life and death. "We watched through the silo door as our barn just seemed to implode," recalled David Miller. "The whole thing went down in seconds under the weight of ice and snow. If we'd stayed there like we first planned, we wouldn't be here to tell the story." Perhaps most remarkable was how quickly knowledge about silo adaptation spread through the community, despite communication limitations. With cell towers down and internet access lost, ranchers relied on shortwave radios and word of mouth to share critical innovations. Each family's adaptations, from insulation techniques to heating methods, were communicated across miles of frozen countryside, creating a rapidly evolving body of survival knowledge. By the second day of the crisis, ranchers were implementing increasingly sophisticated modifications. The Sutherland family created ventilation systems using existing grain auger tubes. The Johnsons designed sleeping platforms above the floor level to take advantage of rising warm air. What began as desperate improvisation evolved into a systematic approach to extreme cold survival, using only the materials and structures already present on their land. As the polar vortex tightened its grip on South Dakota's ranching communities, the window for decision-making narrowed from hours to mere minutes. For many families, the choice to abandon conventional shelter for the uncertain protection of grain silos came at the last possible moment, when rapidly dropping temperatures made the difference between life and death measurable in heartbeats rather than hours. The Jensen family's experience illustrates just how narrow this survival window became. At 7:43 p.m. on that fateful January evening, their farmhouse temperature was hovering around 50 degrees, despite their best efforts with the fireplace. 20 minutes later, after the power grid failed completely, the temperature had plummeted to 36 degrees. By 8:30 p.m., it had dropped below freezing indoors. I put a glass of water on the kitchen counter and watched ice crystals form on top while we were still inside the house, said Margaret Jensen, a 62-year-old grandmother who had weathered 5 decades of South Dakota winters. That's when I knew we weren't going to make it through the night in the house. The Jensen family's decision to relocate to their silo came with just minutes to spare. Temperature readings later recovered from their abandoned farmhouse showed that the interior reached deadly levels of 20 degrees Celsius by midnight, a temperature at which hypothermia can occur in less than 30 minutes, even with winter clothing. If you're following along with this incredible story of survival, hit that subscribe button now and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Have you ever experienced extreme weather that forced you to think creatively about survival? Share your stories below while we continue this remarkable tale of human ingenuity against nature's fury. For emergency responders, the catastrophic speed of temperature drop created an impossible situation. Sheriff Deputy Nathan Harkins of Hyde County attempted to reach stranded families in his department's modified snow vehicle, but was forced to abandon the effort when the vehicle's engine block cracked from the extreme cold less than 2 miles from the station. "I've never seen cold that could disable equipment that quickly," Harkins later testified at a federal emergency response hearing. "Everything was failing. Vehicles, communication equipment, even our cold weather gear wasn't designed for those temperatures. We realized that anyone who hadn't already found adequate shelter was beyond our help." This brutal reality was confirmed when rescuers eventually recovered the bodies of elderly couple Frank and Martha Wilkinson, who had attempted to walk the quarter-mile from their home to their neighbor's farm after their heating failed. They were found just 150 yards from their starting point, having succumbed to the cold within minutes of exposure. In this lethal environment, the speed with which families implemented their silo adaptations became the determining factor in survival. The Blackwood family's original silo conversion took approximately 90 minutes from concept to implementation, a time frame that subsequent families managed to reduce dramatically as word spread about the technique. "We did the whole thing in 27 minutes, recalled Stephen Carlson, whose family of 5 converted their silo after hearing about the method via emergency radio. "We had the benefit of knowing exactly what to do. We preheated the metal cutting tools in our basement wood stove before heading out, which saved critical minutes when cutting the entry door." This process of knowledge transfer and refinement, occurring without modern communication infrastructure, represents one of the most remarkable aspects of the crisis response. Radio operators became critical nodes in an improvised information network, relaying specific details about successful adaptations. Optimal door size, 30x40 inches, small enough to minimize heat loss but large enough for quick entry. Ideal height for wood stoves, floor level, allowing heat to rise naturally, and critical warning about ventilation, necessary to prevent carbon monoxide buildup. For the Davidson family, this shared knowledge arrived with literally minutes to spare. After their farmhouse pipes burst and flooded their main heating area, Father William Davidson made the decision to evacuate to their silo based solely on an emergency broadcast he had heard earlier that day. "The temperature was dropping so fast we could feel it change minute by minute," his wife Caroline remembered. "William had heard just enough on the radio to know it might work, but we were operating purely on faith and desperation." That faith was rewarded when the family's improvised silo shelter reached survivable temperatures just as the youngest Davidson child, 4-year-old Emily, began showing early signs of hypothermia. The family's physician later confirmed that without the rapid warming provided by the silo shelter, Emily would likely have suffered permanent damage or death within another 15-20 minutes of exposure to the cold. The life-saving potential of grain silos during South Dakota's extreme cold event wasn't merely a fortunate coincidence. It was rooted in fundamental principles of physics, engineering, and thermodynamics that, though unknown to most of the ranchers who employed them, created near-ideal emergency shelters against deadly cold. Dr. Elaine Westbrook, professor of agricultural engineering at MIT, has since studied the South Dakota silo shelters as a case study in emergency adaptation. What makes this so fascinating from a scientific perspective is that these agricultural structures possess almost perfectly optimal characteristics for cold weather survival, characteristics that would be prohibitively expensive to design into conventional emergency shelters. The first and perhaps most significant advantage lies in the silo's shape. The cylindrical design creates what engineers call a minimal surface area to volume ratio. In practical terms, this means that compared to rectangular structures of equal capacity, silos expose less surface area to the outside environment, significantly reducing heat loss. For every cubic foot of protected space inside a cylindrical silo, there's approximately 25% less exterior surface losing heat than in a comparably sized rectangular structure, explains Westbrook. In survival situations where every BTU of heat matters, this geometric advantage becomes critical. This efficiency is further enhanced by the absence of corners in cylindrical structures. Thermal imaging studies conducted after the crisis revealed that traditional farm buildings were losing as much as 30% of their heat through corner junctions where walls meet, areas where insulation is typically less effective and where cold air can penetrate more easily. Silos, with their continuous curved walls, eliminated these vulnerable points entirely. The vertical orientation of silos provided another unexpected advantage through natural convection. Currents, when heat sources were placed low in the structure, the warming air naturally rose to the top of the cylinder before cooling and descending along the walls. This created a natural circulation pattern that distributed heat throughout the space without requiring fans or electrical circulation systems that were unavailable during the power outage. The ranchers inadvertently created what we would call a thermosiphon effect, notes Dr. Raymond Chen, a thermal dynamics specialist who studied the phenomenon. It's the same principle used in passive solar heating designs, but occurring naturally due to the silo's shape and height. The metal composition of most modern grain silos, initially seen as a disadvantage by some families due to its high thermal conductivity, actually proved beneficial once the initial warming period was complete. While metal conducts cold efficiently, it also conducts and radiates heat with equal efficiency once warmed. What the ranchers discovered through trial was that after the first few hours of intensive heating, the metal walls began to serve as thermal batteries, explains Chen. They absorbed heat from wood stoves during active burning periods and then slowly released that heat back into the space when fires died down overnight, creating a more stable interior environment. This effect was particularly pronounced in older silos with thicker gauge metal, which provided greater thermal mass. Families sheltering in older silos from the 1960s and 1970s reported more stable temperatures and longer heat retention than those in newer, thinner-walled models. Perhaps most surprisingly, the very purpose for which silos were designed, grain storage, created additional survival advantages. Many of the silos still contained residual grain dust and material in their corrugations and seams, materials engineered to control moisture. This inadvertently helped manage humidity in the improvised shelters, preventing the condensation that might otherwise have formed on cold metal surfaces when suddenly warmed. The scientific principles at work extended beyond the structures themselves to the modifications ranchers made. When families like the Ericksons lined their silo walls with hay bales, they unknowingly created a sophisticated multi-layer insulation system. The air gaps between the metal wall and the hay, and within the hay itself, created dead air spaces that significantly reduced thermal transfer, the same principle used in modern high-efficiency building insulation. What's remarkable is how these improvisations mirror advanced architectural concepts, notes Westbrook. The hay bale linings created what we'd call a thermal break, a deliberate interruption in the path of heat transfer. It's a technique we teach in advanced building science courses, but these ranchers implemented it instinctively under life-threatening pressure. The scientific effectiveness of these adaptations has been quantified in subsequent studies. Temperature sensors placed in reconstructions of the silo shelters demonstrated that with similar inputs of heat energy, the modified silos maintained survivable temperatures using approximately 60% less fuel than conventional farm structures of comparable size during identical weather conditions. As dawn broke on the second day of South Dakota's polar crisis, an extraordinary community response began to emerge across the frost-covered landscape. What started as isolated acts of survival gradually transformed into a coordinated network of mutual aid, with silo shelters becoming not just refuges from the cold, but hubs of community resilience that would forever change how these independent-minded ranchers viewed their interdependence. The first signs of this community response came through the emergency radio network, which had become the only reliable form of communication across the affected counties. Rodney Harkins, a volunteer radio operator working from his own silo shelter, began maintaining a continuous broadcast from his converted grain storage facility, creating what survivors would later call the silo network. "I realized we needed to coordinate," Harkins explained in a subsequent interview with South Dakota Public Broadcasting. People were figuring out improvements to their shelters, better ventilation, more efficient heating methods, ways to protect livestock, but that knowledge wasn't spreading fast enough. Harkins established a regular check-in schedule where families would report their status, share innovations, and coordinate resource distribution. This improvised communication hub became the backbone of the community's collective survival strategy. By noon on the second day, 32 separate silo shelters had been established across the region, housing approximately 140 people and critical livestock. The emerging network revealed unexpected leaders within the community. Sarah Blackwood, a high school science teacher married to Michael Blackwood, became the de facto public health coordinator, using her background to address emerging concerns about carbon monoxide safety in the enclosed silo spaces. Through the radio network, she instructed families on proper ventilation techniques and improvised CO monitors using candles placed near floor level, where the heavier-than-air gas would affect flame behavior. "We had 2 near tragedies from carbon monoxide before Sarah started her safety broadcasts," recalled Jason Miller, who was sheltering with his family near Highmore. Her instructions about watching candle flames for signs of oxygen depletion probably saved dozens of lives. As the crisis extended into its third day, the community began organizing beyond mere survival. The Johansson family's silo, which had been recently reinforced for grain storage expansion, became a central medical station where veterinarian Dr. Linda Johansson adapted her animal care expertise to treat hypothermia, frostbite, and respiratory issues affecting the human population. Perhaps most remarkably, families with more secure shelters began coordinating rescue operations for those still in vulnerable housing. The Peterson brothers, fifth-generation ranchers with extensive winter survival experience, converted a farm tractor by wrapping its cab in multiple layers of quilts and blankets. This improvised rescue vehicle, which they dubbed the Polar Bear, made 7 separate missions to retrieve stranded elderly residents from failing shelters, successfully relocating 11 people to established silo refugees. The cold was so intense that the tractor could only operate for about 20 minutes before we had to return to the silo to thaw the engine block, explained Eric Peterson. "We'd warm it up inside the silo with portable heaters, then make another quick rescue run. It was like a space mission. Limited oxygen, limited time, everything calculated to the minute." As word of the silo shelters spread through emergency channels, the strategy began extending beyond the immediate crisis zone. County emergency management officials, initially skeptical of the unconventional approach, began actively directing at-risk residents toward properties with empty grain silos. By the crisis's 4th day, an estimated 60% of affected rural residents in the 3-county area were sheltering in converted silos rather than conventional structures. The community response extended to resource sharing as well. The Hendrickson family, who operated one of the region's largest cattle operations, used their silo shelter as a distribution hub for firewood, which they had in abundance due to a recent clearing operation on their property. Using snowmobiles modified with insulated cargo sleds, they delivered critical heating supplies to 7 other silo shelters where fuel was running dangerously low. For many families, this coordinated community response represented a profound cultural shift. In a region where self-reliance and independence had long been core values, the silo network created a new understanding of interdependence and mutual aid. As Margaret Jensen observed while coordinating food distribution through the radio network, "We've always been neighbors who help in a pinch, but this was different. This wasn't just borrowing a cup of sugar. This was survival that none of us could have managed alone. The silo network had another unexpected effect. It democratized survival knowledge across traditional boundaries. Innovations developed by newer residents were adopted by multi-generation ranching families, while traditional knowledge from the community's elders spread to recent arrivals. The result was a rapidly evolving body of collective wisdom that transcended the usual social divisions of rural life. When temperatures finally began to rise on January 19th, emerging from the deadly sub-zero range into merely frigid conditions, South Dakota's ranchers cautiously ventured from their silo sanctuaries to assess the devastation across the frozen landscape. What they found was a scene of profound destruction juxtaposed against remarkable survival, a testament to both nature's power and human adaptability. The cold had claimed over 18,000 head of cattle across the affected counties, with economic damages estimated at $26 million. Nearly 40% of conventional farm outbuildings had suffered catastrophic structural damage from the combination of extreme cold, snow load, and wind stress. Power infrastructure wouldn't be fully restored for another 9 days. Yet amidst this devastation, the human toll was remarkably low. While similar cold events historically resulted in significant loss of human life in rural areas, only 3 fatalities were directly attributed to the cold, all individuals who had either refused evacuation or attempted to reach shelter too late. By comparison, a similar though less severe cold event in 1996 had claimed 17 lives in the same region. The silo shelters unquestionably prevented a mass casualty event, stated FEMA Regional Administrator Patricia Hernandez during a congressional hearing on the disaster response. What these communities accomplished with no outside assistance and minimal resources represents one of the most effective grassroots disaster responses we've documented in rural America. National media attention soon focused on the remarkable story, with major networks dispatching crews to document what was being called the silo miracle. Initial coverage treated the phenomenon as a heartwarming human interest story, rural Americans using good old-fashioned ingenuity to overcome adversity. But as engineers, disaster response experts, and climate scientists studied what had occurred, the narrative shifted to recognize the legitimate innovation represented by the community's response. This wasn't just making the best of a bad situation, noted Dr. Harold Lancaster in his testimony to the Senate Subcommittee on Rural Development. These agricultural communities essentially invented an entirely new category of emergency shelter, optimized for extreme cold conditions and implementable with existing rural infrastructure. It deserves serious study as a model for climate adaptation. That study began in earnest when the Department of Homeland Security's Resilient Communities Initiative provided a $1.2 million grant to South Dakota State University to formally document and analyze the silo shelter phenomenon. The resulting research program, led by Dr. Lancaster and involving many of the ranchers who had pioneered the techniques, created standardized protocols for rapid silo conversion during extreme weather events. For the ranching families themselves, recognition came in more personal forms. Tom Blackwood, whose initial idea had sparked the innovation, received the USDA's Civilian Service Medal in a ceremony at the White House Rose Garden. Standing uncomfortably in a borrowed suit, the weathered rancher deflected individual praise. "It wasn't my idea so much as our idea," he insisted to reporters afterward. "Every family that made it work added something important. I just happened to be the first one desperate enough to try something that ridiculous." More meaningful to many community members was the establishment of the South Dakota Silo Safety Network, a formalized version of the emergency communication system that had emerged during the crisis. With federal funding, 120 grain silos across vulnerable regions of the state were pre-modified with proper insulation, safe ventilation systems, emergency doors, and communication equipment, creating a permanent infrastructure of rural emergency shelters designed to activate during future extreme weather events. "The difference now is that we don't have to figure it out while we're freezing," explained Sarah Blackwood, who left her teaching position to become the network's first executive director. "Every designated shelter silo has proper carbon monoxide detectors, ventilation systems designed by actual engineers instead of desperate farmers, and heating systems that don't require constantly feeding wood stoves." For the Erickson family, whose daughter Sila had been born during the crisis, recognition came in the form of a college fund established by donations from across the country after their story gained national attention. People seemed to see her as a symbol of hope, Emma Erickson reflected at her daughter's first birthday celebration, held inside the same silo where she had been born, now professionally renovated as a combination emergency shelter and community gathering space. The long-term impact extended beyond emergency preparedness into everyday agricultural practices. Architects and agricultural engineers began incorporating dual-use features into new silo designs, specifically facilitating their potential conversion to human shelter. The Dakota Model Grain Silo, introduced by a major agricultural equipment manufacturer in 2022, included pre-installed insulation layers, convertible ventilation systems, and reinforced flooring, marketing the design as everyday storage, emergency ready. 4 years after South Dakota's historic cold snap, the legacy of the silo shelters continues to evolve, spreading far beyond the prairie landscapes where it originated. What began as a desperate improvisation has matured into a formalized approach to rural resilience that is transforming how agricultural communities worldwide prepare for extreme weather in an era of climate uncertainty. The most visible aspect of this legacy can be seen in the modified grain silos that now dot the South Dakota landscape. Over 300 of these structures have been officially designated as emergency shelter capable, with discrete blue markers, retrofitted with proper insulation, safe heating alternatives, emergency ventilation systems, and basic survival supplies. During normal operations, they function as traditional agricultural storage, but stand ready for rapid conversion during extreme weather events. The dual-use approach is what makes this system so effective, explains Catherine Martinez, director of FEMA's Rural Resilience Initiative. Unlike dedicated emergency shelters that sit unused most of the time, these structures serve an economic purpose year-round while maintaining emergency readiness. It's a model of efficiency that's particularly well-suited to agricultural communities with limited resources. This efficiency has attracted international attention. Agricultural delegations from Canada, Russia, Mongolia, and Northern European countries have visited South Dakota to study the silo shelter system. In Manitoba, Canada, where temperature extremes mirror those of the northern United States, more than 200 grain silos have been modified following the Dakota Protocol for Emergency Conversion. Perhaps more significant than the physical infrastructure is the change in community preparedness and mindset. The Hyde County Emergency Management Office, which now conducts annual silo shelter drills, reports that average rural family preparation time for extreme cold events has decreased from 24+ hours to under 3 hours, with most families maintaining ready-to-deploy emergency kits specifically designed for silo shelter scenarios. What we're seeing is a fundamental shift in rural emergency planning, notes County Emergency Manager Robert Walking Elk, rather than the traditional approach of shelter in place in conventional homes, which proved inadequate during extreme events, or evacuation to centralized shelters, which is often impossible during winter storms. We've developed this distributed network of micro-shelters that leverages existing agricultural infrastructure. The silo legacy extends into technological innovation as well. Agricultural engineering students at South Dakota State University, many from ranching families directly affected by the 2021 crisis, have developed the Silo Safe monitoring system, an affordable package of sensors that measure structural integrity, internal air quality, temperature gradients, and other safety factors in converted silo shelters. The system, which operates on solar power with battery backup, provides early warning of potential structural or safety issues before they become life-threatening in emergency situations. For the families who pioneered the silo shelter technique, the legacy is both practical and emotional. Tom and Michael Blackwood have become reluctant public speakers, traveling to agricultural communities across the Northern Plains to share their experience and train farmers in rapid silo conversion techniques. Their presentations typically end with Michael's quiet reflection. "We didn't invent anything new. We just saw something that was already there in a different way." Sometimes survival isn't about having more resources, it's about recognizing the resources you already have. The Erickson family, whose daughter Sila was born in a silo during the crisis, has embraced their role in the story more directly. Emma Erickson's children's book, Sila's Silo, which explains emergency preparedness concepts to rural children, has become standard reading in elementary schools across the Northern Plains states. The family maintains their converted silo as both a working agricultural structure and a memorial, with the interior wall bearing the handprints of all 17 people who sheltered there during the crisis. Climate scientists point to the silo shelter phenomenon as an important model of adaptive resilience, the capacity of communities to repurpose existing infrastructure to meet new challenges posed by climate change. Dr. Aisha Mohammed of the National Climate Adaptation Center notes, "What's remarkable about the silo shelter approach is that it doesn't require massive new investments or infrastructure projects. It's a prime example of how human ingenuity and existing resources can be recombined to address emerging threats." For the ranching communities of South Dakota, the legacy transcends practical considerations. The crisis transformed not just their approach to extreme weather, but their understanding of community interdependence. The annual Silo Gathering, held each January to commemorate the crisis, has become an important cultural event where families who sheltered separately now come together to celebrate collective resilience. As climate models predict increasing frequency of extreme weather events across the Great Plains, the lesson of the silos offers both practical guidance and philosophical reassurance that even in the most extreme circumstances, survival often depends not on what we lack, but on recognizing the potential in what we already have.